Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today I have Utopia by Thomas More. Right off the heels of, playing Final Fantasy XIV, I felt this was the work that was most instrumental in inspiring the works of Shadowbringers and more so Endwalker, really. And so I just wanted to give it a read because I've heard it's a very short book, very small book, and just wanted to give it a shot. So first off, this is not very good. I would not recommend this at all. This is not a fun thing to read. It's not interesting. And I guess it is interesting in the sense that this is the very first book of its type where it's a political and philosophical book about a pretend nation, essentially. And I guess this hadn't been done before. I mean, certainly you have Plato's Republic, where they talk and discuss about how a republic and how a country should best be run, and their conclusion there was philosopher kings, essentially. What is interesting, though, is that the preamble, and honestly the life of Thomas More, is almost more interesting than the book itself. But essentially the phrase utopia comes from ua and topos meaning place, and the first part meaning no. So utopia literally means no place or nowhere. It does basically not exist. And so what the book is actually about is a series of, I believe, fictional dialogues between a cardinal, Thomas More himself as a self-insert, and Raphael Hithlode, who is a Portuguese philosopher, who is an obvious reference to Hythlodaeus in Final Fantasy. And as I recall, Hythlode or Hythlodaeus, his name means speaker of nonsense, something like that. So that makes a lot of sense because Hythlode is the character in the book who is describing Utopia. And so he's describing all these fantastical things about this perfect or interesting or weird nation. And it's kind of interesting to see that, it's hard to tell when this country of Utopia is being described, if it's being serious or if it's being kind of a joke. If this is really his idealized version of this place, or if it's just like kind of joking about things, because there's a lot of contradictions in this book. Things like private property is abolished, but at the same token, you have people who inherit their father's houses and things like this. And so there's a few just blazing contradictions. And so Utopia is essentially supposed to be this perfect place. Everything is shared, everything is co-owned, there's no violence, everyone lives in perfect harmony. And what's interesting, too, is that the location of Utopia, I believe in the book, it says it's somewhere near Greece or in that kind of like a Mediterranean context. It's kind of like a crescent-shaped island. And so another really interesting part, actually, at the beginning of this book is the preface, which is honestly more enjoyable reading than the actual book, because it kind of describes how the influence of Greek ideas into Western Europe. A lot of people attribute that to essentially the fall of Byzantium in 1452, and sort of how those the ideas of Plato and Aristotle kind of were imposed, or once those scholars kind of fled from that area. But apparently they say that, there was like a Greek school established about 100 years prior to that event occurring, and so the English were already set up, trying to incorporate Greek ideas and read in Greek, as well as Latin, obviously, which had been the standard up until that point. Oh, and the other thing about Utopia is that there's tolerance for religion. This was a time when Thomas was speaking. There was a lot of division, essentially, within the church and politically. How you just had the creation of the Church of England and this very religious kind of divide between Protestants and Catholics, and how the Church of England just decided to do its own thing, basically. And so Utopia was a place where there was a equal toleration of all religions, essentially, in effect. That very much echoes exactly what the kind of times he was living through. And they also give us in the beginning here, and I need to reread it a little bit, but basically Thomas More, it was interesting that he was actually executed based on that premise that there was some edict that was given that the king essentially was going to be recognized as the King of England and no one could question or criticize him. And one of the people that did criticize him in letters and words was Thomas More, who was put to death for it. And, similar to Socrates for criticizing, the democratic government, they decided he should be executed. And apparently the way they describe, his execution is that he went to the execution block with a smiling face and a good composure and everything, saying that this is, the best way for me to go. And, something like along the lines of they claim it to be the blackest crime committed by the English crown. So actually here it is. While he was in prison, Parliament passed the law of supremacy, which expressly stated that the king should be accepted and reputed the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. That made it high treason for any person maliciously to wish, will, or desire by words and writing to deprive him of this dignity, title, and name of his royal estate. So basically he spoke out and went to the execution block for it. And so you can see how oppressive the regime structures were at this time, just for voicing your opinion. And it was a very chaotic time where new religious and new power institutions were being created, and to speak out against them was just totally forbidden. And with every social movement, it seems like the new movement, everything's going to be all roses and whatever, and it turns out that eventually the people who have free thinking thoughts or free criticisms or nuances get thrown under the bus, as much as they would in the old regime. Yeah, and so the whole Socrates thing, they actually do quote that. They say, Sir James Mackintosh, that no such culprit stopped at any European bar for 1,000 years. It does not seem that in any moral respect Socrates himself could claim superiority. So this is the kind of situation that we find ourselves in, that history repeats itself in this style, with an intellectual who spoke out against power and went to death by public execution, in good terms and nature. And so in the intro of the book, Thomas More and a cardinal and Hythloday are sitting down, and More is bringing up the contentious topic of thievery and its punishment. And so he quotes, the Bible, how, essentially there would be not capital punishment, but equal punishment. I think something like their hand got chopped off. Something where he compares it a lot to Persia, where they say in that country, they do sort of community service, basically. And apparently he was saying that at the time when he wrote this book, that theft was punished with capital punishment. You would be killed or hanged for stealing, as a way to mitigate that. And so they have this big discussion over theft. And then they kind of move on from that, and they have Hythloday in the evening during supper basically give a description of this land of Utopia, which is the other kind of 3/4 of the book. But as I said, I really don't recommend this book because it is painful to read. It is written in Old English, but even in a way that I've read Old English that is not as painful as it is to read this. I'll give you an example eventually, but here's Professor Brewer. More hovers so perpetually over the confines of just and earnest, passes so naturally from one to the other, that the reader is in constant suspense whether his jest is serious or his seriousness is a jest. So a lot of these things about the operations of Utopia, because it's not a place that exists, it's a place that ideally would exist, but also is filled with all these contradictions and contraptions that make it kind of like a Whoville, kind of like almost a fairy tale land, almost filled with ideas, but not exactly a serious place to take. So here's an example, some of the writing from the book. For as the severity was too great, so the remedy was not effectual. Simple theft not being so great a crime that it ought to cost a man his life, no punishment, how severe soever, being able to restrain those from robbing who can find no other way of livelihood. In this, said I, not only you in England, but a great part of the world imitate some ill masters, that are readier to chastise their scholars than to teach them. So it's like, it's fine, I guess, and it makes its point. There's plenty of works now where we think, what about this fictional state? So I guess it was the first time, again, something like this was done, but the way it's written is just, it hurts. It literally hurt to read this book, so I can't recommend it. If you've played Final Fantasy 14 and you're really interested in the ancient society and Elpis and Hythlodaeus and Emet-Selch, it would be better to just read fan fiction, or honestly Plato's Republic, than this, because ouch. It's just not well written, and this is one of those books where the concept and the content, or rather the concept of the book, is very kind of revolutionary, very new, very interesting, but the content and the way it's executed is just really rough. It's, the very first video game, or the first movie, or the first, the first of something that, here's a novel idea, but my God, do we have better things compared to this now? But it is still interesting just to read how people wrote back then, how people thought back then, and just to kind of get an insight into that world. But, again, this book is maybe only like, you can tell there from, the size of the text and everything. This book is only like 100 pages, and like 30 pages are the preface. And like, I can read 100 pages of Don Quixote in the afternoon, but for this took me like a couple days, because I had to take breaks in between. And, I think you're getting the point. Just don't read this. Maybe read the summary. Read about Thomas More himself. He's an interesting character. But yeah, this is not something I can recommend. But I read it, so you don't have to. So let me just give you some pieces and notes here that I've taken over the book, so you don't have to read it for sure. And so here he goes on about theft. It is a vain thing to boast of your severity in punishing theft, which, though it may have the appearance of justice, yet in itself is neither just nor convenient. For if you suffer your people to be ill-educated and their manners to be corrupted from their infancy, and then punish them for those crimes which are their first education, dispose them. What else is to be concluded from this, but you first make thieves and then punish them? And so this is the first time you'll see, for lack of a better word, kind of leftist thought. Essentially, I'm not sure if John Locke came out before or after this guy. This was like the early 1500s. Yeah, 1516. I'm not sure about John Locke, who had the tabula rasa, and it's this whole concept that a nurturistic society is the main conductor of someone's being, essentially, and their behavior. That if we simply treat someone better, they would have no reason to engage in thievery or in this kind of manner, and that would be the ultimate kind of thing. So if we just change our laws, if we just change our attitudes, that will in turn change the nature of men away from the things that they illy love and the vices which are congruent in their souls, essentially. So finally, on the nation of Utopia. So it's a crescent-shaped island somewhere in the Mediterranean, I believe, or some kind of island nation. So essentially, it's weird. So they have no property. They divide their wealth amongst each other. And so at first you might think this sounds like a socialist or communist kind of state, but at the same time they do have a dedicated slave class. And what's interesting is the only way that you can get into the slave class is by essentially doing some very heinous crime. And apparently there's this law, or kind of like a temperament, it's not official, that those of their native people who are their own slaves are treated more harshly than those of foreign slaves that they might get through conquering other nations who inherit them. They also have this idea where slavery is also voluntary, that if you are a poor person or another slave from another country, you can voluntarily come to Utopia and volunteer to be a slave. And again, it's this this conflict of ownership, the fact that no one owns a house, but people can own slaves is kind of strange. They also talk about, despite the slavery, there are kind of the religion of Utopia, and I will get that into that later, but they kind of have this priest slash social worker class that apparently work even harder than the slaves, and they kind of give themselves to the religious idea of good works, and so they actually work harder and are literally public servants who work more than the slaves, and apparently are happy to do so. There are different classes of individuals. Most people are encouraged to work, essentially, that you do have to work and find your profession. And the only kind of exclusion to that is that if you follow a scholarly pursuit, then you have to spend your days in lectures. And so there's this kind of thing where at the beginning of each day at like 9 a.m. in the town square, there's going to be a talk or a lecture about a certain intellectual topic. And for most people, they don't have to attend, but if you are of the scholarly class, then you have to attend those lectures and spend the rest of your day studying or doing whatever. What's also interesting, and I'll find it later to get the exact hours, but apparently they only have a 6-hour workday, which I guess sounds pretty cool, sounds pretty nice. And the other hours are spent essentially in... Well, it's not in total free time. There's like, I think, how do you divide this? There's 8 hours for sleep, 6 hours for work, 4 hours for like extracurricular and sort of compulsory tasks, and then the rest are spent on distractions. And, well, he doesn't call it free time. He calls them distractions. Oh, yeah, and there's also, he also, did this thing where, you can tell he's just a full-blown like nurturist, where he says certain citizens will have the decision that in their spare time they can either use it on distractions or on optional military training, as if one would choose one or over the other. It'd be very obvious which one they would choose. But he said, yeah, you have the option to do military training, and the whole kind of military around Utopia is that they're non-expansionist and they are defensive, but they also go and engage in wars if they have a treaty with another country that also goes into a war, or will help defend that country if they are attacked. And, well, we all know how well that works for non-expansionism. If you are allies with an expansionist power, then you're going to be dragged into everything anyway. The other thing that's really interesting about property, and specifically houses, is that anyone can go and live in anyone's house at any time, apparently. And if they don't essentially give up the house, they have this yearly, or every 10 years, they have this event where essentially everyone switches houses. And again, this doesn't even make sense to me in the same like chapter, because he also says one of the great accomplishments that the Utopians like to boast about is that they have these beautiful gardens and these beautiful rose gardens, and they all kind of live in these houses. And he says, very specifically, there's a front door and a back door and a garden, and they take very good maintenance of these. And it's like, well, what if you move into a house that has a really bad garden? What if someone didn't take care of it? Because, well, and of course, you have to remember this is all slightly fantasy, where everyone is, this perfect citizen and everything just happens to work. This is the perfect society, not something that essentially should be imposed, but something that is almost of philosophical fancy, so to speak. And yet there is such an equality that every man lives in plenty. When I compare them to so many other nations that are still making new laws and yet can never bring their constitution to a right regulation, where, notwithstanding everyone has his own property, yet all the laws that they can invent have not the power to obtain or preserve it. So what he's meaning there is essentially the Utopians don't have a lot of laws, and apparently despite them believing in equitable distribution, no one has more than anyone else, essentially. He also has this little story that in ancient times some Romans and Egyptians shipwrecked themselves on this island, and it was so nice they decided to stay, apparently. And so, here's the actual very beginning, the description of the island itself. The island of Utopia is in the middle of 200 miles broad, and holds almost at the same breadth over a great part of it, but it grows narrow towards both ends. Its figure is not unlike a crescent. Between its horns the sea comes in 11 miles broad, and spreads itself into a great bay, which is environed with land to the compass of about 500 miles, and is well secured from winds in this bay. There is no great current. The whole coast is, as it were, one continued harbor, which gives all that live in the island great convenience for mutual commerce. So, that's basically an island nation, and it has all these things, and its geography. And he goes on to describe everything from its governance of its religion, its military, its people, its social services, its climate, and everything. And so here's interesting. They talk about, the cities and how every city is more or less the same, except for the capital, which is called Amaro. Every city sends 3 of its wisest senators once a year to Amarat to consult about the coming concerns. For that is the chief town of the island, being situated near the center of it, so that it is the most convenient place for their assemblies. The jurisdiction of every city extends at least 20 miles, and where the towns lie wider, they have much more ground. No town desires to enlarge its bounds. Here's interesting how it describes its family structures. How so you have God, I've already forgotten exactly at the top, but essentially you have family units, and then multiple families multiple families are put into other different family groups, and then there's a matriarch and a patriarch for a group of 30 or 40 families. And what's also interesting is that there's a it sounds like an RTS. There's a designated population cap for each family, that it has to be between 8 and 13 children roughly, and that if there is a lack of children in one area or a surplus of children in another area, then they will be transferred as if they have no familial bonds. No country family, fewer than 40 men and women in it, besides 2 slaves. There is a master and a mistress set over every family, and over 30 families there is a magistrate. Every year, 20 of this family come back to the town after they have stayed 2 years in the country. So you have a family, you have a matriarch and a patriarch, and then of 30 families, you have a magistrate. They say that their main source of food is chickens. They breed an infinite multitude of chickens in a very curious manner, for the hens do not sit and hatch them, but a vast number of eggs are laid in a gentle and equal heat in order to be hatched, and they are no sooner out of the shell and able to stir abroad, but they seem to consider that those feed them as their mothers and follow them as other chickens do the hen that hatch them. They sow no corn but that which is to be their bread, for they drink either wine, cider, or perry, and often water, sometimes boiled with honey and licorice, which they abound, and though they know exactly how much corn will serve every town and all that tract a country which belongs to it. When they want anything in the country which it does not produce, they fetch it from the town without carrying anything in exchange for it, and the magistrates of the town take care to see it given them. So if you want a rare crop or a rare animal, I guess, you just go to where it is and you just take it from the magistrate, and they just have to be like, yep, you can take this. I'm sure that won't result in any kind of bureaucracy. The magistrates of the town take the care to see it given them, and meet generally in the town once a month upon a festival day. So the magistrates have their own kind of convocation once a month, but then once a year they send all of their senators for a convocation to Amarat. So again, that is literally taken out of this book and put in Endwalker. About Amarat, it lies upon the side of a hill, or rather a rising ground. Its figure is almost square, for from the one side of it, which shoots up to the top of the hill, it runs down a descent of 2 miles to the river Anider. As it runs by Amarot, it is grown by half a mile broad, but still it grows larger and larger until after 60 miles course below it, it is lost in the ocean, between the town and the sea, and for some miles above the town, it ebbs and flows every 6 hours with a strong current. I'm not sure if maybe they read too much into that and said it was literally sunken underwater, which it's like in the game, but it is interesting to note that there is a large water theme and a huge piece of water beside Amarot. No property among them, every man freely living to his house whatsoever. At every 10 years' end, they shift the houses by lots and cultivate their gardens with great care. The whole town is both most useful and most pleasant, so he who has founded the town seems to have taken care of nothing more than of their own gardens. Oh yeah, and then he goes into this whole history where the magistrate is also called a syphogrant, but is now called a philarch. So you're just throwing in some Greek words here just to really, this will confuse the reader and confuse me. It's just like extra words for magistrate, like I get this is the guy in charge. But yeah. Of all the syphogrants, there are 200. Choose the prince out of a list of 4 who is named by the people of the 4 divisions of the city. And they doth take an oath before they proceed to an election, that they will choose him whom they think most fit for office. They give him their voices secretly, so that it is known for whom everyone gives his suffrage. The prince is for life, unless he is removed upon suspicion of some design to enslave the people. The Tranibors are new chosen every year, but yet they are for the most part continued. All their other magistrates are only annual. The Tranibors meet every 3rd day, and oftener if necessary, and consult with the prince, either concerning the affairs of the state in general, or such private differences as may arise sometimes among the people, though the falls out but seldom. There are only 2 syphogrants called into the public council chamber, and these are changed every day. It is a fundamental rule of their government that no conclusion can be made in anything that relates to the public till it is first debated 3 several days in their council. It is death for any to meet and consult concerning the state, but unless it is either in the ordinary council or in the assembly of the whole body of the people. So basically, if we compare the government here in Utopia to the one in Endwalker, at least from my understanding, a recollection of Endwalker, since it's been about a year since I played it, you essentially had the convocation of the 14. Each one had a specific title role, like Emexelk or Fandaniel or Azem, and so they would each fill these roles, a specific function in the government, and they would meet as a convocation and sort of democratically choose what to do with the people. And that certainly is here in the fact that the syphogrants are, come and represent their specific towns. There's not 14 of them, though. There's 200. But they do, in this version, they have a prince, and they also have essentially his counselors, which are also princes in contention for being elected, once that prince passes away or is forcefully abdicated in extreme circumstances. So there is some aspects of 14 that they took from this book, but there is definitely a lot more that either they didn't expand on or didn't show or didn't feel was necessary to talk about. But the kind of baseline is pretty much what they have here, which is interesting. Oh, sorry. One rule that they have is they never debate a thing. They never debate a thing on the same day which it is first proposed, for that is always referred to in the next meeting, so that they may not so rashly in the heat of discourse engage themselves too soon. So if you bring up a new problem, then it has to be discussed essentially the next day. But yeah, that's pretty much the government of Amarot and how Utopia is run. Then it goes into talk about the kinds of industries. They have the manufacture of wool, flax, masonry, smith's work. Women, for the most part, deal in wool and flax, which best suit their weaker nature. This is actually interesting on the dress code that everyone wears the same kind of suits that only differentiate them based on their sex and if they're married or unmarried. So they basically have 4 different kinds of costumes or dresses that you were allowed to wear, which is essentially man married unmarried, woman married unmarried. And he goes on this big rant a little bit where he talks about silk clothes and how essentially, I guess he's kind of saying that, the rich in England at this time would wear multiple, layers of silk clothes, while here it is sufficient for one layer, for the average person. And so everything is very much built on equality. It's very much built on, that kind of socialist aspect to make, a happy kind of median between people. What's really interesting, though, is he talks about the perspective of fancy clothes and gold, and essentially that there are slaves in the city, or in general, rather. The slaves are essentially marked with a piercing or a shaved part of their ear, so that even if they do escape, they can't say that they're not a slave because they have that mark on them. But what's also apparently pierced in the ear is a piece of gold. And so there's this whole idea that the value that they place on gold is reversed. And it's this big thing that when, a rich nation comes to do negotiations and all their magistrates have, decked out and multiple layers of silk and their golden chariot and all this stuff, that when they see the utopians who don't have need for the avarice or greed of these things, that they will be amazed and aghast, like, oh, how could they not? You put only one layer of silk on, and you put, your gold and admonish your, and so essentially, the idea is that, the foreigners would be, you deify, you give your gold away to your servants, to your slaves. How foolish we are is what the reaction is expected to be. And it's funny because they say the utopians don't mind parting with their gold, so there's no matter in the enemy nations just simply asking for it because they should give it freely because it doesn't mean anything to them. So they shouldn't have any gold in the first place. But it does say because they don't spend their money, they stockpile all their gold in order to hire mercenaries in case of a war. So it's this thing like, oh yeah, we don't care about gold, but we really keep it aside. And so again, it's like, I don't know if Moore is joking or if he's genuinely hypocritical in this respect. Here's the other thing too, there's no danger in a man asking for more than he needs. They have no inducements to do this, since they are sure they shall always be supplied. It is fear of want that makes any of the whole race of animals either greedy or ravenous. So he's essentially saying that, the only reason for greed is scarcity, that the idea that there is going to be a shortage or a drought is what drives people to stockpile and to take more than what they need. Again, this is all nurture over nature, that no one can be naturally greedy or whatever. Pride that makes him fancy in a particular glory to excel others in pomp and excess, but by the laws of the utopians there is no room for this. So pride, avarice are not essentially condoned. This is also the funny part where they also believe in peaceful means. They don't really believe, they believe it's uncouth essentially to kill animals, but they're not vegetarians because they still need to eat meat. And so they say that all the slaughter of animals is only done by their slaves so that they don't have to feel bad for doing it. I don't know, that feels kind of very realistic that, someone who doesn't want to acknowledge the suffering of others is just going to get a proxy to do it rather than, solve the solution outright. They get a proxy to do it, so they just don't feel bad about it. Yeah, so since they have no use for money among themselves, but keep it as a provision against events which seldom happen, and between them they are generally long intervening intervals, they value it no further than it deserves, that is in proportion to its use. So if gold is a good conductor, they use it as a conductor. If silver is good at this, they use it for that. They don't put any imagined value on these rare metals, essentially, except that they are rare. Here's kind of a quick overview of their religion. Their religion and its principles, that the soul of man is immortal and that God in his goodness has designed that it should be happy, and that he has therefore appointed rewards for good and virtuous actions, and punishments for vice, to be distributed after this life. Though these principles of religion are conveyed down among them by tradition, they think that even reason itself determines a man to believe and acknowledge them, and freely confess that if they were taken away, no man should be so insensible as to not seek after pleasure by all possible means, lawful or unlawful, using only this caution. And he goes on to explain the nature of pleasure. And so this is kind of where, again, like God, like Thomas, you're killing me, because he redefines pleasure in the sense that it essentially is virtue, and virtue doesn't exist, that people attain pleasure by doing good things, by going to morning lectures, not engaging in drugs or vices or gambling, because those aren't real pleasures, those are fake pleasures. So he mixes it around to try to justify it, that the natural inclination of pleasure for the utopians is doing a just and upstanding job, I guess, which is not unrealistic, but it's not ideal. It's not true to exact human nature. For they think it is the maddest thing in the world to pursue virtue. That is a sour and difficult thing. So virtue in this case is him saying, like, virtue is a thing that you do for the good of the people, but it's not something that you genuinely believe, that it's not genuine, essentially. Yeah, the severe pursuer of virtue, such as an enemy to pleasure. Since no man can be no more bound to look after the good of another than after his own, for nature cannot direct us to be good and kind to others, yet at the same time to be merciful and cruel to ourselves, thus as they define virtue to be living according to nature. So they imagine that nature prompts all people on to seek pleasure. So again, he's conflating and redefining the ideas of pleasure and virtue and how they are different from each other or the same thing. Upon those delights which men by a foolish though common mistake call pleasure, as if they could change as easily the nature of things as the use of words, as things that greatly obstruct their real happiness understand instead of advancing it, because they so entirely possess the minds of those that are not captivated by them with the false notion of pleasure, that there is no room left for pleasures of a truer or purer kind. So there it is right there. True pleasure is doing the right thing, apparently. Actually, I do like this line. What they delight in find is only a false shadow of joy. So there's some poetry in this book, but among a lot of it, it is really just dry, trite, clinical musings, frankly. And it would be much better if it was written in a different fashion, but the fashion that it's in is, again, just antiquated and just painful to go through. Also, I don't know why he put this here, but I laugh. I don't know, but whenever there's a monkey in a story, I just find it very funny. On plans to which, to my great regret, was imperfect, for having laid my book carelessly by while we were at sea, a monkey had seized upon it and in many places torn out the leaves. He just added that in there. Like this little anecdote. I mean, usually a lot of this Raphael Hythloday is just like, oh yeah, these are their whatever. But he gives us one anecdote where, I don't know if this actually happened to Thomas More, where a monkey came and tore out his book by the ocean. It's just like a funny aside that just like, wait, what? You're just like, okay, and then suddenly monkey time. Yeah. He also calls the universe a great machine of the universe to view to the view of the only creatures capable of contemplating it, so the exact and curious observer who admires his workmanship is much more acceptable to him. So this is kind of the beginning of at least what I call the mechanistic view of the scientific Christian universe, where up until I think the time of Newton, that scientists in the Western world saw the universe as a kind of mechanism to be deconstructed, and that by revealing different aspects of the mechanism, from physics to mathematics and deep space exploration, that one could come to understand the mind of God in a Christian, religious, and spiritual, and also scientific pursuit conjoined. Also, there's one part I can't really make heads or tails of it, but it does link back to a little bit of Endwalker about voluntary death, i.e. that, in Endwalker's case, they're mortal beings, so to die is really not a big deal for them because it's always voluntary. So it says here that a voluntary death, whether it is chosen upon such an authority, it is very honorable. So if a man takes away his own life without the approbation of the priests and the Senate, they give him none of the honors of a decent funeral, but throw his body into a ditch. So it's kind of this idea that it says here, by starvation or opium, someone can choose to end their life, and it can get assent from the authorities. So that is very similar in Endwalker, where you have, the characters essentially having a voluntary death system in place. Women are not married before 18, nor their men before 22, which is an interesting rule, I guess. If they run into forbidden embraces before marriage, they are severely punished, and the privilege of marriage is denied them unless they can attain a special warrant for their case. Such disorders cast great reproach upon the master and mistress of the family in which they happen, for to suppose that they have failed in their duty. The reason of punishing this severely is because they think that if they were not strictly restrained from all vagrant appetites, very few would engage in a state in which they venture the quiet of their whole lives by being confined to one person. Before marriage, some grave matron presents the bride. Oh, this is really bizarre. They present the bride naked, whether she's a virgin or a widow, to the bridegroom, who basically is also naked. And, we both laughed at this and condemned it very indecent. But on the other hand, he brings up the point, why would they do this, is because, he brings up the analogy of a guy buying a young horse. When you buy a new young horse, you want to make sure that it's athletic, and you inspect every aspect of it, from the legs to, the head, and, if it has any diseases or anything. So kind of a weird analogy and a weird custom, kind of reducing people to just their physical, representations. But he's saying in the aspect of marriage that this is apparently is very important. So it's like, okay, all right. And of course, if someone is cheated on, they give them leave to the victim to marry again, and for the other person to be punished. Again, this is really interesting on religion. The island has, every town have some worshipping the sun, others the moon, others the planets, some worship some men, and some have been the environment eminent in former times for virtue of their glory, and other deities, and also the supreme God. Yet the greater and wiser sort of them worship none of these, but adore one eternal, invisible, infinite, incomprehensible deity as the being that is far beyond all our apprehensions, and is spread through the whole universe, not by his bulk, but by his power and virtue. Him they call the Father of all, and his name is Mithras. And for any of you know who about Mithraism, Mithraism is a pagan sect that had a sort of hero figure who slew this cosmic bull, and he's popular during the late Roman era. And so it's interesting that is kind of their main religion that they parrot here in Utopia. But yeah, there's not much else to say about it. Basically, Raphael Hythloday collapses after telling them all about Utopia, and they kind of, tuck him into bed. Basically, that's how it ends. But yeah, no, that's Utopia basically. Kind of a gist of it. Again, I can't recommend this book just because it's very hard to read, very painful to read. I read other things around this time period and before this that are even easier than this. But yeah, all in all, interesting book, interesting relations to Final Fantasy XIV, but nothing that made me go, oh wow, that's so cool. It's like, hey, they name dropped Amaro. Yeah, like cool, like whatever. But in terms of other things this has inspired, I'd be interested to see. But yeah, if you're into this kind of stuff, it's very short, so maybe give it a go. But anyway, guys, that's all I got to say about it. Anyway, I'll see you guys later, and as always, keep reading.